Hey everybody, welcome to Publishing Disrupted podcast. I'm Mick Silva.
And I'm David Morris.
And we are two former Christian publishing experts exploring the ways that book publishing is changing. Disruption is what we're talking about. So, and mostly how to help writers best meet the challenge, but obviously any professional who's trying to come at this at a more normal level, less professional, more conversational.
Yep.
I even said confessional recently to my wife. She's like, "Oh, is that what you guys are doing in there?" Like, yeah,
we do have things to confess
confession
as
booth,
former Christian publishing professionals.
We have to get things off our chest.
Yeah, we're still publishing professionals, by the way. We're just
right.
It's just different now.
I tend to. I told you last time. I tend to be aggressively informal. That's just the way I approach life, because I don't like to have pretense. And coming from the backgrounds that we come from as pastors' kids, which we could probably get into a little bit more at some point.
Oh yeah, we're sick of pretenses.
We don't like the pretense.
There's a common thread there.
But professionalism,
baseline.
I mean, obviously, you have to be a professional in this industry. And particularly as book publishers, there's something of a, there's a pretense that just comes with it. We talked about the ivory tower. We've talked about, just kind of the idea of publishing is something of an erudite profession. And, there's a lot of smart people in it. And you don't want to come off as a Johnny-come-lately or just a money grubber, but you do want to have, some sort of like approachability as well. I guess I sort of struggle with that balance. I don't know about you, but we're kind of getting deep already. So.
Yeah.
What have you been up to? What's new in your life? I know you did some traveling recently, but
I did some personal traveling, vacation time into Europe. I've been there a couple of times.
Sweet.
And it's nice to be in another world. Just working really hard at Lake Drive Books and Hyponymous Literary. I do literary agenting, part of the time.
Yeah.
And we actually, this will be public by the time this is out, I'm sure, and it's public. But we've had Audrey Claire Farley join us as a literary agent.
Yeah.
Audrey's a PhD and literary scholar, author of a best-selling nonfiction narrative book, which I'm not going to try to describe the title right now because I'll mess it up. Super educated, intelligent, thoughtful human being who's always wanted and knows a fair amount about publishing, who's always wanted to get into being an agent because she feels like she can source authors.
Okay.
So
right on.
That's something right there. Someone who can naturally be connected to other authors who might have some pretty deep, she calls a lot of her own writing, I want to say nonfiction reportage or journalistic history, really fascinating kinds of writing.
That's cool.
That we don't see nearly enough of. Yeah.
But she knows people and she's a connector maybe and sees the personality profile of authors and that's really useful. And that, I mean, I've been thinking like, what are we going to talk about this time? And what do authors need to know that we haven't covered yet? And I think last time we talked about some of the top questions we get. And I kind of wanted to dig into like book development as a whole, like what we do with authors and how we help them understand like what it takes to be a good author and how do you develop a project? What does that look like? There's, of course, a myriad ways to do this, but I think we have particular style maybe in how we approach it, particularly as nonfiction and maybe even as progressive nonfiction publishers, editors. How are we sharing our process with, who we're trying to serve? I guess if you think of us as service providers, how do we describe what we do for people? And to me, that's what's been disrupted maybe the most in terms of my daily life. How I describe what I do to people is almost so different from when I first started. I mean, obviously I'm not in-house anymore, so that I don't have a title, so I have to describe to people, I'm a coach, I'm an editor. I mean, that even is a little bit squishy. What does that mean? It can sound like a counselor or something, which, sometimes I do. I tell people I'm not a counselor, but how can I best help people? And then what makes a book sellable? How do you know when a book is a good idea? And I mean, that's a big, broad question. there's a lot of different things that makes a book sellable in your mind when you're going after something, or an author, what makes them viable, long term, like not just one book.
Right.
I mean, do you have answers for that off the top of your head? Or
it's always a combination of things,
it's a
right?
conversation first, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's different features to every book. I remember when we were in editorial meetings together, and it's known inside publishing, at publishing team meetings, editorial team meetings, that sometimes you rank proposals. You might, and it's been a while since I've thought about this, so I'm not going to remember it as disciplined as I was in the past.
It was weekly.
But you would rank, the meetings were weekly,
Yeah.
but you would rank a proposal by like editorial strength,
Yep.
strength of the concept, strength of the platform, at least those things.
Right.
And it would spit out a number. We might have refined it a little bit more than that.
But kind of those three areas.
Right. So you could be really strong on platform, but maybe not so strong on writing or even uniqueness of idea. But that still might make it a worthwhile project.
Yeah. If you can sell it and it's
Right.
somewhat familiar in the market, but we don't have a book exactly like that before, we might go for it.
Yeah. So I mean, we've talked a lot about platforms so far, and there's always more to talk about with regard to that.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes too in publishing, and I don't want to sound cliche about this, but it's true that platform drives a lot of publishing.
For sure.
And so those other, sometimes people call them three legs of the stool. There's the platform, but there's of course, the concept and the writing
and the craft
where
of
it really starts.
How you put it together. And I guess to me, book development sort of defaults into how did you put this book together? It defaults into the craft, like the voice and the style, and like the organization of the material. Even I said before we were recording, I think a lot of times I'm the bucket of cold water for an author because I'm the bad guy as the editor to say we need to back up and develop this concept better. There's some points in chapter 5 you haven't really fleshed out, and we need more illustration of that, or maybe you're taking this in a direction that isn't as practical and applicable to your audience as it needs to be. So we often are pulling back before we even get to like talking about marketing and sales, and then that helps to define the audience better, right? So as we're developing those sales materials later on down the line, it behooves an author to have started with a strong development of that concept, with usually some professional help. I'm going to argue for that, I guess. It's sort of a hand in glove approach. You're not doing it in a complete separate category to yourself. Like there's competition out there that you have to match, and there's more competition than ever before. And I guess in one way, the disruption of the market is, to me, like we have to respond to the higher competition that's out there. And then an editor is helping you to recognize what's your competition. That's where we talk about competitive titles. In the proposal.
And that's I think more talking about being in a major publishing program. We're conditioned to sort of think that way as publishing professionals. Along the lines of our publishing disrupted theme, or in the new roles that we both find ourselves in. We're publishing more, what you might say, creative or more innovative kinds of things. So the competition is more like, what are the things we don't want to do, or keep repeating like everybody else keeps repeating.
How is this different, maybe, than what's out there?
When I'm working, when authors contact me, and they're very early in their process, one of the first things I'll say is, it's always a good idea to go through the exercise of doing a book proposal. Sometimes folks will balk because they're like, well, I don't know if this is a good idea yet. And I will sometimes say, well, first off, I'm pretty busy as a publishing professional, and you've got to take some time to, if you can't put a proposal together with some facility, that means you haven't already thought through what you're doing, or maybe you're not even ready as an author platform-wise. So as a courtesy, sometimes I think that's the way to go. And so there's that, but then also it's a very healthy exercise to go through.
That's right.
All the components of a book proposal. and that includes the concept and the the writing, the organization and structure of the book, as well as the marketing and the platform.
Right.
And if you can pull off a good book proposal, who cares what that agent thinks or what that editor thinks? You figured something out, and you'll go get it out there one way or the other.
Find a different agent that can sell it. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's never wasted time to put a book proposal together. But I often will say it starts with the hardest part is the sample writing and the chapter outline. The idea might be good, but it's often in the execution.
That's right.
And that's where I feel like that's where there's like a sense of process. You mentioned the word process earlier.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And I think this is where we find some similarity between my job previously in-house and maybe you too, looking for, the best books that are standouts, and now, because as much as we're looking for what's different in the market, we were before as well, but we were trying to plug holes almost when we were in-house. There's so many books, even on our own list, that are kind of competitive with what we're already doing.
Each other. Yeah, I remember
they were saying the same things.
We had like 5 marriage books in one year once.
Yeah, or just women's interest in particular. I just feel like there were so many of these self-helpy, right?
Yeah.
Like women teachers.
At least they replaced a lot of the pastor books, but
no, right. And I'm not speaking ill of them at all. I just think that it's hard to you will. It's hard to distinguish those books at a certain point. So that's where it comes down to craft and how the method is different, right? Maybe the message is the same, but you're coming at it from a different angle, at least different enough. Maybe there's drawings, or maybe there's it's more design heavy, or it's giftable, or you try to soup up the package a little bit so that it'll look different. Now we're not doing that so much. It's less. This sounds pejorative, but it's that felt like sleight of hand almost. No, this is new, really. It is. I promise. Now it's
and they have 100,000 Instagram followers. Of course, it's new.
Now it's I don't really do that as much. I'm actually looking for something that is a new idea to begin with that I haven't seen in a book before, which feels really satisfying. And then even the method that the person's using is coming from, like we talked about last time with author marketing, that comes from an authentic place. I'm looking for a person, right? That then defined their process in coming to this message, and then they show you their method, right? It's almost there's this memoir aspect, I guess, to everything that's nonfiction now. I don't want to just have someone, an authority on high, telling me what's true and what's good, right? I want to see how they've applied it. I want to know why this has changed their life. I'm looking for life change. In the books that I'm.
It sounds to me like you're talking about what is innovative these days.
Yeah, sure.
Especially in being in religious publishing, historically it's been knowledge from on high.
Sure.
Particularly if you're a man.
The tradition that's there,
or you've got degrees after your name.
Exactly right. Yeah. Authority is.
Or you got a big church.
From the theological perspective, and how well you can define that theological space.
But even for a self-help book, from a PhD or even let's say a clinical psychologist, you want to have the human there too.
Now,
and not just the dry, technical, supposedly scientific information. Of course, all psychologists are scientific. But
sure, but let's assume.
Speaking as one, kind of.
Yeah, no, you're getting at something I think that is a major disruption, and that is sort of the you generation, or the talking about what I saw recently in the Atlantic. We're basically we're this anti-traditional, anti-establishment culture now, and I don't know that we can put things back in the box.
Right.
That everybody has their own sort of distinctiveness.
Right. That's what we need more of, is
uniqueness, right?
Instead of mass culture that
and
just crushes us.
Yes, exactly. And so what we used to do was we would attach to these identity sort of surrogates, whether that was a pastor or a church or even just biblical authority. I've heard that one so much recently. I'm on that on my Facebook.
Oh, how nauseating.
It's really, it is. It's quite, it makes me feel gross. But we're trying to define ourselves for ourselves against a lot of this traditional sort of establishment authoritarianism, frankly. And I think that's where I'm coming from as an editor, trying to help people understand the disruption in the market, that you can't go back to like just relying on these old forms of authority, that your power actually now comes from your identity. And then when you understand that concept that you're trying to put forth, and you understand the method that you used, and you're interpreting that on the page for someone, that's your process.
So in a book proposal that you're evaluating, that would be, you're talking about voice.
Talking about voice, but you see how it's like the hand in glove thing. The concept is gloved in the method that you used, right? So let's take an example of like, say, self-help, or like someone who's talking about overcoming anxiety,
with a spiritual
how they did
bent.
it. Sure. Or even just like a humanist bent. They wanted to overcome this thing. They're telling you their story of how they did it, what their process looked like, right? Maybe it's not even memoir. Maybe it's got like points.
But how they did it,
how they did it,
or what they discovered.
And they're using their own illustrations, their own life, and maybe even talking to other people who have done this. I mean, you could go about it many different ways.
Right.
But I've seen that proposal many times, and yet each time it's unique because the person who's doing it is unique, and I want to bring that out more.
Right.
As an editor, I want to see like, how did you approach it that was different from someone else?
Right.
And that's just exciting, right? That makes you feel like, well, I might not be just like that person on the page, but at least I see like that there was a process there, and that then relates to my life.
So that comes out not just in the tone, but it's hand in glove with the concept.
Yes.
You were saying.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Craft, concept, kind of like
concept meaning like the titling even has to be, and the description has to talk about this person, not just as a credentialed writer, but as someone who's writing within a context.
Yes. Yes. And is it a memoir, or this is a question I have all the time. It is a memoir, or is it self-help? Like, which category are we talking about?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's difficult.
Especially in religious, spiritual titles.
Right.
There's the lines are blurred for sure.
Because now we're getting at like what makes it a book. You know, and sometimes I think
makes it readable and fun to read.
Maybe it needs to be a blog post, or maybe it's even a blog series, or maybe it's a podcast, right? And we can explore these differences. But like how a book is different is that now you're capturing something that's essential to the process that you put in place to then like offer to someone and say, this is what I did, you know, and this I think will be valuable to your life. Here's my story, whatever.
Talk about breaking that down for a chapter outline in a book proposal. Yeah.
Simplest way would be like 3 points.
But take what you're saying in terms of concept and voice. How does that look in terms of a 10 or 12 chapter nonfiction, 60,000 word book?
Yeah, because then we're getting into like book development and how do you do that? And it's gonna matter on you know, are you looking to write a memoir? I mean, is this like, you know, you go from point A to point B? Like you came out of, let's say, fundamentalism, and now you're talking about like having a more open, inclusive faith. Because if that's the journey, then we're going to have to look for some landmarks and look backward.
I would say shift the example a little bit more toward spiritual growth, self-help. Even if it is about the journey of.
Well, and then you're thinking of that like a long form article. If you're familiar with maybe articles in the New Yorker or Atlantic or even the Bulwark I've been reading recently, they have some good long form articles. And if you're familiar with that form, then you can write a book outline.
So it's the
same thing.
What's the outline?
So the simplest way to break it down for me is like a story. There's 3 points. There's the setup, which is like telling me where I'm starting from. That's the context. Tell me where you started from. Usually you're describing the big problem that you're facing, or that you had faced, and why you went on this journey, right? It was do or die time. I had to either figure this out or I was going to, you know, crumble. And that's the setup. And then the complication is where things get worse before they get better. That's Act 2. Act 2 is basically where, you know, you're trying to figure out what you're doing, and you're stumbling along in the dark for a long time. And then as soon as you get to the crisis moment, you go into Act 3, and that's the resolution. And usually the resolution is pretty ambiguous, I'd say, these days. I mean, less so earlier. But now I think people don't like things nice and neat and packaged anymore. We like to think that you got the victory by just going on a journey. A lot of people will say when you get to the end of a book and if it feels too wrapped up, they don't actually enjoy that as much. You do still want to have that satisfaction of relief, that you're not still in the
resolution,
darkness, right?
Right.
Some sort of resolution.
Right. Unlike the rest of us, I'm sorry, I'm going to diverge. Have you watched that on Max?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
It's
not a big
little
enough
too
nerd
wrapped up.
with regard to the show and the video game, but it's like,
Sure.
I don't, like, I'm sorry, Pedro Pascal?
How perfect.
Why
right?
is he not? What's going on? All right.
It's a good show, though. We've enjoyed
I mean,
it.
talk about things didn't go as you thought might happen. But
Right?
they went so differently that
Yeah.
where is that resolution?
Yeah, that's true.
It lost me. It really lost me.
Yeah, it does sort of take a left turn.
Yeah.
And I think just surprise is probably the point in TV these days. You got to keep your audience surprised.
Yeah.
But yeah, so with a book though, I do feel like you have to set up the right expectation in that setup, right? What are we getting out of this journey? And book development, I think, requires that to be very clear.
What if it's more like, if it really is more expository and explanatory?
Absolutely.
As a faith deconstruction story, or as like,
Right.
let's say you're a spiritual director or a religious trauma therapist, or someone
Some
who
people,
who has learned some things and studied the topic.
Yep.
And you've got those 10 or 12 chapters. It's kind of intriguing to think about how things didn't go like you expected.
Exactly.
To sort of start laying out, like say, if it's 10 or 12 chapters, let's say 10 of them are like your 10 sub-themes
Sure. Yep.
of the process.
That develops your idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now obviously you can talk about the deconstruction journey is kind of getting worse before it gets better.
Exactly. Your personal.
It's not turning out how
Yeah.
it got worse before it got better.
Yep. Yep.
But you could also talk about that from a conceptual point of view, it would seem to me. Or you can even, like, your concepts could even not serve you well after, to a certain point.
Yeah. Now
Like
you have
if
to
you just-
discard some of that.
If you just get so far in your deconstruction journey
Yeah.
and you're doing this, and this, you're still gonna lose.
Yeah. Exactly.
If you can't go,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you're still gonna find yourself bending back into, trying to prove that there's a right way to understand Jesus.
No, right. Yeah. Or even,
Which I'm sorry, folks, that's part of the problem too.
there's a right way. And
No
this
matter
is the
what
thing,
right way.
like you have an outline. And I think this is common for most authors as they work on their idea. You have an outline. You start writing into that outline. It starts changing on you. Should I stick to the outline or not? Or should I go off grid here? I think my advice almost invariably is go ahead and follow that, because you've got to know what's down that side road. Otherwise, you're always sticking to the formula, and you're not going to find the satisfying answer that you hoped for at the end of it. If you're using your book to learn, you've got to go on the journey. That's not going to serve you ultimately if you're just trying to write it because you think you've got to stick to your outline, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of times we get into trouble when we're not willing to go on that side quest and find the other tool that's waiting for you over in the bushes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I like how you're talking about that though, because there's the conceptual, there's the sort of outline that you're trying to sort of stick to and help guide your journey, but then there's the personal, which is always messier and never quite what you hope for, maybe, and disappointing to you. And it's always going to be a little bit of a disappointment to you because it's not as neat and tidy. And as an editor, I would love it. I'm Enneagram 5, but like the logician in me would love it if we could just stick to the outline.
Right.
But
Right.
we can't.
Right.
And so at some point I just finally said, like, well, what happens if you don't? Do you come up with a new outline? I mean, usually, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say about 2/3 of the way through that outline, it's going to start changing on you.
Yeah, and I like to talk about that as the creative process. And,
Yeah.
and I often will say, and I am sure I must not be the only one who's ever said this, but the creative process never stops until you like put the pen down or you close the computer and say, I'm not tweaking this thing anymore.
How do you know when you're done? Well, because you stopped.
Yeah, but when you submit a book proposal and then you find out you're writing a different book as you go along, well, that's gonna happen. You should tell your editor while you're, before you get too far with the new thing. But
is this okay?
But it will happen.
Yeah,
and I think most editors understand that.
Yeah. A good editor does understand that.
Yeah.
I honestly feel like that's a better book than what they sold to their team most of the time. Because that author's then listening to a higher calling, you know?
This is why market testing only gets you so far, folks.
That's right. Yeah.
I've been involved in a lot of market testing. And
that
they're
is
like,
so
hey,
useless.
you changed the idea from there to there. Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's, it's a better idea now. So what if it wasn't tested the way you want?
Exactly. And they're always going to say something that's just not even relevant.
Yeah.
And they don't know what they want. That's the difficulty I have is, even as an editor, it's like I sold this one book, and if I hold to that and I make the author change it, that's not going to be a good book. The author's going to feel, like they're over a barrel. They basically got the money, so now they have to submit that book. But like if I just go with them and help my team understand this book needed to change, this is going to be a better book.
Yeah.
Then that's going to sell well.
So what about, getting, like we're talking about the book proposal again.
Yeah.
Say you've got your chapter outline going, and you've roughed out, like a 200-word description for each chapter.
Good, right.
All 10 or 12 chapters.
Yep.
And it might have been hard. It might have taken you a while
Sure.
to get there, and you wonder if you're going to be able to stick to it as you write the actual chapters.
Right.
But you've done that, and now, whether it was in this order or not, now you've got a sample chapter to write. I'm often saying I want to see both a sample chapter as well as a beta version of an introduction, an introductory chapter.
Sure.
Now, you can't really write an introduction until you've written the whole book.
Yep.
But
that's a good note.
But it's still, at the proposal stage, you need to put something down because that's going to be a longer form understanding of what will eventually become the overview or the short description.
That's your intention. Exactly right. Yeah.
So that out of the way, the introduction chapter needs to be in there. But what I really want to see is is a sample of a typical chapter.
Right.
How are you going to structure it? What do you, how much story are you going to use? How many citations are you going to use?
Good. Right.
And just what, where does it begin? Where does it end?
Yeah.
What's in the middle?
Well, and there's so much that's represented in there, right? The personality of the person you're dealing with.
Back to the tone and the voice.
Yeah. And are they going to be able to finish this book? I think a lot of times I get an idea. You sent me something recently, just to evaluate, and it was a proposal, and there was a sample chapter in there, and it felt a little weak. It felt like, I don't know if this is going to be able to be, get finished.
A whole manuscript.
They might need to get some coaching, like to make sure that they can reach the finish line. And I don't really know. I mean, if I had to come up with 3 reasons why it felt that way, I guess it felt similar to some rough drafts that I've written myself about an idea as you're working your way into a concept. There's just something reads as though that's like an early conception of that idea.
Yep.
And then later on, as it's refined more, there seems to be just more perspectives that have been brought into maybe that sample chapter. It's not simply your own and trying to get your idea across. It's as though there's other voices in that chapter speaking into this concept, and the author is holding it more open-handed. They're not trying to pound the pulpit so much. You know what I mean? It feels a little more open-handed is my term. But
sometimes too many declarative statements in short paragraphs means you're not using the whole paragraph to
this is what it meant,
it.
And this is where we're going. And it's a very early concept that does that or says things that way. And I guess as you return to the drawing board, as you get some input from your editor or your coach or even your agent or publisher, hey, go back and bring this perspective to bear on it.
I remember one book I had worked on this kept a while back in the evangelical publishing days, there was a pastor saying, you need to. Whoops.
Very familiar. Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's what we grew up with, right?
Yeah.
Those were kind of the early days of Christian publishing as well.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the books, that's what people were looking for. Just tell me the right answer and I'll do it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Tell me how to parent my kid and I'll do it. And what we found out is that doesn't work as well. Those kids grew up and, the promises did not come to fruition. So now what, So a lot of us are looking for the books to say, okay, maybe don't delete everything that came before, but at least like refine it. Like, let's develop that. Let's go on this journey as individuals, find out the right way to parent this child or to be married to this person. And then that will define how you should be married, or how you should be a parent.
Talk about. I wonder if we could talk about a sample chapter of a book that isn't necessarily a subject matter expert.
Okay.
Like you're working with someone who's a psychologist, and it's about there's like a lot of attachment theory in there. Let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about something that's strictly a memoir with a resolution.
Right.
Memoir. Maybe it has some of the good qualifications of a memoir, like extreme experience, unique experience.
Sure.
Is a lot of it that drives a lot of memoir, or connected to a theme that's really important right now. That drives a lot of memoir.
Or anxiety. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. Or racism.
Sure.
Sexuality.
Yep.
Feminism or something. Talk about something that's more. Because this is what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Quite often, I definitely want some more subject matter experts. Don't have enough, but something that's more like a spiritual writing.
Yeah.
Like say let's say it's a book about just understanding a sense of peace. What would you like to see in a chapter on a book about peace from a spiritual minded writer? It could be someone who is a pastor or a teacher in some way.
Okay.
It could be an everyday person who's just super thoughtful, beautiful with words, great speaker, good on Instagram. But how would you want that person to start the chapter on the topic of finding peace in nature, for example? Sorry if I'm just setting this up.
No, that's
too
really
much.
Good. Because last time we talked about Barbara Brown Taylor and the fact that she's using nature now as kind of the guide to find God, right? It could look like that. It could be very much just like finding God in nature and how they went on that journey, what that looked like for them. Like maybe they were doing their research phase for the first half of the book, like trying to figure out, what did Annie Diller say about that? What did Richard Rohr say? These types of, like I'm coming at this from a newest perspective. Like maybe I'm like digging in my garden one day and I have an enlightened or moment or epiphany about God, and I go in and I write it down. Like that could be a very interesting journey. And I've said before, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is basically a walk around a lake, or a walk around a pond.
That's an amazing book.
That's all it is. And it's just a daily sort of journal. Repository of these spiritual thoughts, of
noticing things.
That's right.
Going
waking
slow.
up, and that is a classic, right? And how did that happen? Well, that's somebody paying real close attention at a very critical point in her life, and talking about it.
Right.
That's it.
Yep.
But like you're not going to find that kind of book very often. And we know, we could go down a list of those types of books.
Especially in individualistic, entrepreneurial, always on the make American religious life.
We need something that's going to fix our problem, right?
Right.
Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is not what you're giving people to fix their problem.
Yeah.
But like it does. I would argue that it does better than a pill. Like, because you're slowing down. Yeah. And I went on a run.
That's Annie Dillard, right? She's the one who says that, how do you approach God or in prayer unless you're actually on your knees?
Yes.
Do you remember her saying that?
Yeah, totally.
I've never forgotten that one.
It's yes, exactly. This gets at the humbling process. I was on a run today, and I didn't want to stop because you don't want to stop. You're out there to run. You're supposed to. It's going to get hot, and it's harder to start when you stop.
It's really humid. We've gotten some really intense heat. Yeah,
and it doesn't cool down. So like even in the morning, it's like still at 80. So like I was, I had my shirt wet and everything, so I was ready. But like I had to stop because I had this thought, and it was like I know. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to receive this. But I had to slow down, stop, pay attention to the thought, and know that when I start again, it's going to be fine. It's better to capture this thing. And I don't even remember what it was. I wrote it down on my phone. But like it was basically about slowing down and recognizing that that's usually the answer. I don't want that to be the answer because I'm a fighter. I tend to, I tell myself I'm not ambitious because I am. I try not to admit it to myself, but like if I can slow
Most of us would
down-
not be able to say what you just said, Mick. That's really good.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's only because I've been able to slow
You
down
tell-
on my runs.
I tell myself I'm not ambitious, probably because I am.
Because I am. And like,
And
I don't,
That's so true. It's
yeah,
just
I
so
don't
true.
want to be, you know? So then I stop and I take down the thought and I slow down, and it's like that could be a chapter in my book. Maybe I'm writing to my daughter who can't really receive this right now because she's 19 and it's hard, and you know, life feels like you have to define yourself against everything. At least it did for me at that age. So I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want to be like everybody on YouTube or like, you know, everything I'm seeing in the movies. I want to be myself. And what does that even mean? I don't know, but I know it's not that. So I'm basically defining myself against everything.
Yeah.
So on this run, and I stop and I take down the thought, and I'm like, okay, if you could just slow down and recognize that you're not trying to fight everything all the time. If you're just trying to allow for humans to be human, and you are one, you have to receive in order to be able to give.
Right.
Take this in, allow this to change you, and be chastened by it. The fact that you are human, that you have to, you know, wash yourself every day and eat and just be a normal person. Like, you don't have to be that different. It's not that important.
Yeah, see, everything you just said, I would love to actually have been sitting down and reading a very thoughtfully written
Right? That belongs in the
chapter
book.
that took me 30 minutes to read.
Well, it's because I've read
Yeah.
books that I can say that
And
stuff.
where you find stuff like that
Yeah.
right now.
That's what I'm looking for as well. And I'm trying to get to, like, we're not going to be able to find an Annie Dillard. We're probably not even going to be able to find like a Lauren Winner or, you know, Barbara Brown Taylor or Phyllis Dickel or whoever. But
John O'Donohue.
we can describe the process. We can say, what have you gotten out of those books? How can you then, like, use your research, build off the things that came before you, stand on the shoulders of the giants, and then say what your journey was and why it's different. I would argue Brene Brown is doing that.
Yep.
I would argue Glennon Doyle is doing that.
And
Anne Lamott
did
is
it.
doing that.
Yep.
Susan Cain in Quiet is doing that, and Bittersweet is doing that. So these are people who are outside the Christian market, but at the same time, they're using very
There's a pattern
research-driven.
here.
Right? Do you know how many people were at Zondervan and now no longer publish at Zondervan and have gone independent? Like, a lot.
Oh.
It's very interesting to me.
Oh.
So, like,
Yeah.
Rachel Hilda Evans was one. Anyway, we
Yeah.
can go on.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a lot of those names.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway, yeah, I think there's a launching pad that happens where you're like, oh, I have a new thought. I need to capture this. And then you start just like following your bliss in a way, like what your curiosity leads you to. And then that becomes your process. That becomes your books.
Right.
That's hard to find. That's somebody with a voice that's like developed that and respected it enough to capture it on paper.
Suddenly, putting a book proposal together sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
a life journey.
If you
right?
can tap into some of what is being said here.
Yeah. And so developing that process, there's a 1, 2, 3. There's what was the setup? What was my normal context? How did it become worse before it became better? That's the complication, and then the resolution.
Yeah.
What have I ended up with? It's somewhat still ambiguous. But
And that works for both the chapter outline of the whole book, but also works within the chapter, that same structure.
absolutely
Yeah.
within the chapters.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I tell people, like you said, you want to see an introduction first. I tell people usually that's like setting up the big problem that you had to solve, and then telling people in so many words that you're going to get to, like, at least a attempt at an answer or something that looks like I went on a journey and I got this treasure, and the treasure wasn't what I expected it to be. That sounds intriguing. I want to read that book, right? And that happens over and over. That's like every story.
Even a
honestly.
social scientist working through a problem, I thought this was what I was going to find, and this is instead I found this. Boy.
Brene Brown says that in her vulnerability
If more
talk.
people would
Yes.
writ like that,
That's right.
especially even social scientists.
She was like mad at the research because it was telling her exactly where she didn't want to go.
Would it be that a pastor writes like that? My
I
goodness.
know. It's so authentic and real. I'm just like, that's why I do what I do. And I think that's why you do what you do. You're trying to come at this from a very personal, understandable, relatable approach, right? And that is your approach. I'm not sure we got to all the points in the outline that we need to get to, but we can
that was
continue
good.
next time.
We're riffing, man.
Yeah.
That's what this is all about.
Also, I talk a lot, and you ask good questions, and I need to flip the script a little bit and ask you questions.
It was my counseling psychology course in as an undergrad, and my introvert.
That's
so.
good stuff. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we will pick this up again next time. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Keep writing, everybody. I was watching, speaking of Anne Lamott, I was watching, I saw an Instagram post. She was interviewing somebody. I don't remember who it was. Obviously somebody who's like a writing person, writing professional. And he was talking about how, there's different kinds of writers. There's people who are really smart and know their stuff and really should be writing. And then there's people who maybe aren't quite that, but they're actually writing every day. And he said the real writers are the second group.
That's right. That's really good. Yeah. I hate it, but it's true.
It was a little bit dogmatic sounding and very passionate when he stated it.
Sure.
But I think there's, you've got to take everything with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of truth. Just keeping going.
That's right. Every day. A little bit every day. Like eating an elephant. All right. We'll see you next time.